Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Zara and today I'm going to be giving you some recommendations for short sci-fi and fantasy books that you may want to pick up if you're feeling tired of reading long series and you just want a break from that. So I've got 5 recommendations on this list, so with that in mind, let's jump in. So the first book that I'm going to recommend you is a book called Hero's Journey by Sterling E. Lanier. I have done a full review of this book and it was absolutely fantastic. Nobody talks about this book and yet it is fantastic. This is a book about a man who is basically going in search for not memorabilia because I can't think of the word, but he's going in search for human artifacts after a kind of end of the world event has happened. There's some really interesting exploration around religion, but also identity and purpose. There's also some really great tension because we don't really know what caused the end of the world event to happen. And here is just a well-written character. I think he's quite a likable character. He's not perfect. He's very much flawed. But yet we can feel a sense of empathy towards him because of the situation that he finds himself in. So one thing that I didn't mention in my review that I actually think is very pertinent to flag is that Sterling E. Lanier, which I don't think many people know this, was responsible for getting Dune published. He read the manuscript for the book, absolutely loved it, and then I think he spent a while trying to get it published. I think that gives an indication of what sort of sci-fi he liked. And also, I do think that's reflected in his writing as well. So I do think if you like Dune, then I think this is a book that you could potentially get on with very well. There is some really interesting stuff around climate and the natural order that gets talked about a lot in Dune. That also gets talked a lot about in this book. So I think if you are a Dune fan, you want a short read, and it's also, I believe, only 2 books, then this is one that I definitely recommend. The next one that I'm going to recommend is a novella, and this is a sci-fi novella by a self-published author, and that is The Genesis of Change by Olivia J. Elliott. If you have an interest in alchemy and very maths and physicsy based magic systems, then you need to read this book. It is fantastic. It's so good. I'm dying for more set in this world because there's just so many things in it that I like, and I just need more and more exploration of it. Olivia is a talented writer. She writes very compelling characters, and I think for a novella, the pacing has to be particularly solid. And I have to say, in this novella, it was fantastic. We have 2 alchemists who are basically sent on a mission, and we're basically following them on their respective missions. And I'm not going to say more than that because I don't want to spoil it. If you like hard sci-fi books, and even if you don't and you want to start kind of experimenting more with your sci-fi, then I think this is a really, really good place to start. But also if you do like hard sci-fi, then I think you would really appreciate this one. The next book I'm going to recommend is The Just City by Jo Walton. I have talked about this book a little bit on my channel, but I think it deserves more of a shout out. This is my favorite kind of sci-fi. It's very philosophical. It even borders into fantasy slightly because there's definitely some fantasy elements in it. But it's basically a thought experiment about, and the characters in this book are trying to implement Plato's Republic in real time. And it kind of just goes through that process, but then also it kind of highlights what was potentially wrong about Plato's Republic. It almost emphasizes that Plato forgot that humans are humans in some ways, because there's some very obvious things that go horribly wrong in this thought experiment when it's playing out. And I think some of that could have been maybe recontextualized if you remember that human beings are just human beings and we do really idiotic stuff sometimes. But I think it's just such a fascinating book because The Republic is one of my favorite philosophy works. I love that book so much. I try to read that and Nicomachean Ethics every single year. And even if I don't read the full book, I will always dip into it multiple times a year, that and Nicomachean Ethics. It was just wonderful to kind of see this thought experiment playing out. And I think Jo Walton just has an absolutely beautiful writing style, and she really does justice to this type of story, I think. It's fantastic. It's such an underrated gem. Nobody talks about it, and yet I just think it's one of the most fantastic philosophical sci-fi fantasy books that I've read. It is a trilogy, but you could also read this as a standalone. The first book reads very quickly. I think it's 250 pages. So it's very, very easy to get through. We have 2 left. The next one that I'm going to recommend is Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer. This is also a sci-fi book, and this is fantastic. This was really solid for me. One of my favorite things about Jeff Vandermeer's writing in this book is just the tension that he's able to build over the progression of the book. This is a pretty short book, and yet he's able to create this very oppressive feel to the story. And I just think that takes a lot of skill, and I just think he did it absolutely masterfully. There's so much tension that you could literally cut it with a knife. There is so much tension. It's just so good. Annihilation is essentially about a group of women who go into this kind of like area that's like no man's land, and they basically go to explore it and try to figure out what's happening there. And it's just so atmospheric. I think this is probably one of the most atmospheric books I've read, just because of the sheer skill of Vandermeer's writing. Like, I don't know how he does it. That you just, it's palpable. Like, you don't know what's going to happen next. You don't know what they're going to come across. And you're just kind of sat on the edge of your seat the entire time. Absolutely fantastic. Feels very vivid, the world, and very alive. It is part of a trilogy. It's called the Southern Reach trilogy, but in my opinion, you can very much read book one as a standalone. And it's also a very, very quick read. The final one on my list is New York Minute by Stephen Aryan. Stephen Aryan is actually a traditionally published author, but this book he decided to self-publish. And this also technically isn't fantasy. It's like a crime noir kind of thriller vibe. But in my opinion, it reads like an urban fantasy book, like a very low fantasy urban vibe, because it's set in New York, obviously. And our main character is basically tasked with helping a criminal overlord to find his daughter who goes missing. It is a novella, and yet it didn't feel like a novella. And I mean that in the best way possible, because it's such a well-written story. And so much is packed into like 150 pages. It's actually like crazy when you get to the end and you're like, what? Like, that's it? It's over like that quickly? Because so much happens, and he's able to finish off the story in a way that makes sense and doesn't make you feel like you're missing out on something. So I think this is a really great one. If you want something that isn't necessarily fantasy or sci-fi, but has that kind of feel of like an urban fantasy book with a bit of a noir element to it, then I think this is one that you should definitely pick up. It's super easy and quick to read. Fantastic. So there we have it. Those are 5 short sci-fi and fantasy books that I recommend to you if you want something that's a bit quicker to read. We read so many books that are long and drawn out, and while there is definitely a place for that and it can be very rewarding, sometimes you just need a quick fix to get you in the spirit. So I hope you like this video. If you have any quick sci-fi or fantasy reads to recommend to myself or to others, please list them down below, and I'll see you then. Thanks for watching, folks. Stay safe as always, take care, and I'll see you very soon. Bye.